Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Welcome everybody to our session number 26, the chapter of John. Hope everybody had a good week. Hope everybody is doing well. Admittedly, this is one of the least interesting chapters of the book, as you probably figured out yourself. Not much new material is introduced to it or reinforcing any other material from the previous chapters. The chapter of Zechariah, which we will cover next week, is going to get a little bit more interesting. But let's just get cracking into this, and then it's a short chapter, so it'll go pretty quickly. And then afterwards, we'll have our discussion. So the Wisdom of Majesty, Hikmat al-Jaliyah or Jalaliyah, in the word of John, fi kalima Yahya'iyah. He says, this is the wisdom of precedence with respect to names, since God names him Yahya or John, which is to say that the memory of Zechariah lives, Yahya or Yuhya, on through him. And we did not name anyone before him with that name. He combined in himself both the attribute of prophecy inherent in all those that have passed on, but whose memory lives on in a son, and the distinction of being named in that way. He named him John, or Yahya, and his father's name lives on like true knowledge. For Adam's memory lived on through Seth, Noah's through Shem, and likewise with other prophets. However, God had never before John combined a self-explanatory name with the attribute except from concern for Zechariah when he said, "Give me from yourself a hair." Here he places God before his son, just as Asiya mentions the neighbor, namely God, before the house, Beit, saying, "O my Lord, build for me with you a dwelling in paradise." I actually comment on this very prayer in the chapter of Asiya in my Effulgences of Wisdom, and use the 7 words in it as kind of a marker to explain the 7 creative attributive imprints that we find in Imami Hadith, the Khisal al-Sab. So God honored him by fulfilling his need and named him by his attribute, that his name became a reminder of what his prophet Zechariah had asked of him, since he had stressed the continuance of the remembrance of God in his offspring, a son being the secret essence of his father. We'll let this person in. The secret essence of his father, who will inherit from me and from the people of Jacob, being none other than the inheritance of the state of God's remembrance and supplication to him. Then he tells him of the well-being bestowed on him the day he was born, the day he would die, and the day he would be brought forth living. Here he uses the word life, hay, which is the meaning of his name, and informs Zechariah of his bestowal of well-being on his son. God's speech is true and conclusive. If the revealing spirit had said, well-being be upon me the day I was born, the day I will die, and the day I am brought forth living, it would better have expressed the state of identity, which this is the verse that applies to Jesus. It is, however, better in that it combines the notion of identity and belief, which is less susceptible to misinterpretation. What was unusual and remarkable in the case of Jesus was his ability to speak in the cradle, since in making him articulate, God made his intelligence perfect and effective. It does not follow that everyone thus enabled to speak is sincere in what he says, except one who is attested like John. I'll just take a sip of this coffee. The divine well-being bestowed on John is less susceptible to ambiguity with respect to the divine concern for him than that of Jesus, which he pronounced on himself, even though the situation indicates his proximity to God and sincerity in the matter. Since, in speaking in the cradle, he was seeking only to prove the innocence of his mother. Other evidence of this is the dried up trunk of the palm tree that dropped fresh fruit without being fertilized by the male, just as Mary bore Jesus without the normal sexual union with a male, which is actually a somewhat taqiyya sort of contradiction to what he said earlier in the chapter of Jesus. But that's okay. That's Ibn Arabi. Were some prophet to say that his sign and miracle was that a certain wall should speak, and were that wall to say that he was a liar and that he was not the apostle of God, the sign by itself would be valid and would confirm his apostleship, no attention being paid to what the wall actually said. Since then such a possibility of misunderstanding is implicit in the speaking by Jesus in his cradle when referred to by his mother, the divine wall being bestowed on John is less ambiguous in this respect. Such evidence that he is the servant of God is necessary because of those that assert that he's the son of God, the speaking in the cradle being sufficient in itself. Those who assert that he was a prophet also regard him as a servant of God. There will remain certain possibilities of misunderstanding until in the future his veracity with respect to all he uttered in the cradle will become clear. So realize what we have touched on here. Now, the thing is, in this chapter, Ibn Arabi is sort of, very arbitrarily shifting in between John and Jesus, with, in my opinion, not really finishing the thought as regards to the station of life that his name indicates regarding Yahya, John himself. So this is one of my criticisms of this particular chapter. It's as if he's kind of hurriedly going through to finish the chapter without finishing his thought in regards to it. Anyway, I open the floor to your insights, to your thoughts, revelations, rants, whatever you want to talk about. Anybody? Jeff, you want to say something?
What? Do I want to say something?
Okay.
Yeah. Or
I unmute
Hassan.
my
Okay,
microphone.
Hassan, go ahead. Go ahead.
So, reading Sheikh Muhyiddin, I get impression that when even Quran speaks, in some cases it speaks not directly, but in some kind of taqiyya.
Yes.
Here, about Jesus, Isa alayhi salam, paradoxically, on one side, it states that it is a servant of God, but on the other side, it confirms the very high station
Yep.
of Isa alayhi salam. Because of the ayah, and peace be upon me the day which I was born and will die and will be resurrected. And here, when Isa alayhi salam is speaking about him, give impression that God is speaking about himself, the ittihad of position between Isa alayhi salam and Allah Ta'ala, in difference from what is said about Yahya. Allah Ta'ala speaks about him from the position of a third person.
Yes.
And also that Isa alayhi salam is Ruhullah, directly said about him, which also gives him a very high station. Would you like to comment about it?
This chapter, like I just said, is a bit hurried, I find, and I've kind of tried to figure out why that is, because there is so much that Ibn Arabi could have said about John, Yahya, by just the implication of the name alone, and why Yahya is named Yahya. Now, when you go into the Ismaili literature, Yahya is considered a hujjah, okay, of the Natiq of the time. And some of the early Ismaili philosophers and esoterics, and someone like Abu Yaqub Sajistani, really unpack this name in an extremely profound way in some of their works, and position him in relation to Jesus, the whole Hujjat Natiq dichotomy that we have in Ismaili texts. I think that Ibn Arabi, even with the verses of the Quran that he cites here, could have very easily done this in his own scheme, by juxtaposing John and Jesus in his scheme of the pole and the Imam of the right and the Imam of the left, but he doesn't do it here. And so my question regarding this chapter is then why quote these chapters without unpacking the hierarchy, the esoteric hierarchy in relation to John and Jesus in this particular chapter, in the overall scheme of Ibn Arabi's soteriology, if you would. So, what can one say? I mean, we can, extrapolate a few things from this. I've had to go back to, the botanies myself time and time again, to try to understand deeper to what Ibn Arabi is saying here in this particular chapter. Because I think this chapter is a bit of it's like a filler before his chapter on Zechariah. And he could have said a lot more here. Like, for example, what is the difference between Ruh Allah, right, which is the epithet of Jesus, and the name Yahya, which derives from the attribute of al-Hayy? What relationship of proximity or even distance can we establish between these two attributes? In this particular scheme, and Ibn Arabi leaves this unanswered, and disappointingly, he doesn't really answer that question in any of his other works, including his Futuhat al-Makkiyah. So I think the sky is the limit where this particular chapter is concerned in trying to derive particular correspondences and meanings, because Ibn Arabi doesn't do it. And if you look, at the commentators, the first couple of generation of commentators from what's what we need to next century. Hold on. Okay. So we need to look at other people and other works to try to make sense of what Ibn Arabi is saying here. So your interpretation is basically as valid as anybody else, because none of the commentators, to my satisfaction anyway, other than one, and that is Ibn Turkeh, seem to really tackle this particular chapter on the level that that I would want to see it, or you would want to see it. So, to go back to this particular verse, that particular verse, what being upon the day that I was born, the day I will die, and the day I am brought forth living again, is applied to Jesus in this particular chapter that is related to John. And he doesn't really give us I think a very deep tafsir on how this then specifically relates to John himself, other than the fact that he says at the end of the paragraph, it does not follow that everyone that's able to speak is sincere in what he said, except one who's attested like John. So but my question is that what does this have to do with the verse? And why are you glossing this particular verse to the narrative about Jesus speaking in the cradle? What of these two things have to do with each other? And this chapter has never answered that question, in my opinion, and nor have any of the commentators either.
Another point, do you think that also there is intended paradox in the good sense of the word by Allah Himself giving the name Yahya because he is one of the little prophets, at least from the mentioned in Fusus Hikam, about which it is known that they were killed intentionally in the end of their life. That exactly the one who was killed, he is given the name Yahya, in some sense that which will live to the end of the history.
Yes. This is a very interesting point. that this figure that is even mentioned as being killed in the Quran, and also in the New Testament. If we take the New Testament Aramaic, the name of John is Yohanna. And Yohanna itself is derived from the attribute of Chai, which is the same as I in Arabic. So this is the paradox of life and death, that within life exists death and death is life, in a sense. And this is the paradox that the name of John contains within himself. That, that which is the principle of life is also the principle of death. So then we find this in the Quran, yuhyi wa yumit, thumma yumit wa yuhyi. It brings to life, it revives and takes life and gives life again. And this is, if I were to rewrite this chapter myself, this is the paradox from that Quranic verse that I would play on, precisely this very point that you put your finger on. That John, as number one, the harbinger and the mubashir of Jesus, at least in the standard Orthodox narrative of that relationship between John and Jesus, is the one who is attested by both traditions of Christianity and Islam to have been killed, whereas the crucifixion of Jesus, at least exoterically, is a disputed narrative within Islam. But yet, his name is extremely important in understanding this paradox of life and death for that very reason. Yeah.
And the last one question, which is more technical, but I think there is an element of sophistry where saying that in performing the miracle of speaking of Isa alayhi salam, when he says, I am so on and so on and so on, and Sheikh Muhyiddin saying, it is miracle in that baby speaks. But it doesn't imply necessarily what is spoken that it is truth. Of which one I cannot understand or accept that.
Okay, that's a very good point.
Do you understand my point?
Yeah, I understand. In both Qunawi's al-Fukuk, which is the kind of a summary commentary on the Fusus al-Hikam, very similar to Ibn Arabi's own Naqsh on the Fusus al-Hikam. Qunawi, and then later after him, with Qaisari's super commentary on the Fusus al-Hikam, what they cite is that, because we don't know what Jesus said, we just know he spoke from the cradle, but what did he say? Both Qunawi and Qaisari say, cite a Sunni hadith, which says that basically Jesus defended the virtue of his mother. So if Mary was being accused of being unchaste in the progenitation of Jesus, what Jesus spoke from the cradle was a defense of his mother. So that is basically, according to the hadith, the Sunni hadith tradition, this is what is claimed to have happened of Jesus' defense of Mary.
But my point is that it is miracle in the aspect of speaking, but it does not necessitate that what has spoken of this baby, it is truth. And that it was truth, it was confirmed later. So my question is, let's say from your perspective, from Shia perspective, more generally, can we make such separation of these two aspects, or when we have miracle, we take it as a miracle and as a proof in all aspects, not that it was miracle only in the fact that baby speaks, but all that that this baby has spoken, we take it as the truth as a whole, without any doubt. Is my question clear?
Okay, can you actually phrase a question out of this?
Okay. Uh, Let me, because here I trace little bit of again of Ash'ari traces of Ash'ari Kalam polemics. Uh, were some prophet to say that his sign and miracle was that a certain wall should speak,
Hmm,
and were that wall to say that he was a liar and that he was not the apostle of God, the sign by itself would be valid and
mhm,
would confirm his apostleship, no attention being paid to what the wall actually said. And
hmm.
here is my problem. Wouldn't it be exactly the opposite? If the wall say this is man, is not prophet, uh, it would disclose him as a liar and not the. Do you understand?
I understand what you're saying. That's my own criticism because I find the example to be weak in here. But I kind of get the point that Ibn Arabi is trying to make. Number one, because walls don't speak or walls don't write. So if we kind of remove the immediate metaphor or symbol here, what is Ibn Arabi trying to say? The wall would represent negation. It would be the nath, whereas the prophet affirming his own apostleship would be the affirmation. So the wall would be la ilaha, and the apostle would be the illallah. I think this is the general roundabout kind of point that Ibn Arabi is attempting to make. But the way he's phrasing it, I just find it extremely weak. That's why I'm saying it. This whole chapter sounds to me a little bit hurried. There were so many points that he could have extrapolated to really glean the station of John, Johanna. I look at this chapter as a bit of a waste, to tell you the truth. But yeah, it is a bit of what you say is true.
So
It's
it is maybe like what is the important is the form, not the
yeah,
matter. That the fact
yeah,
that it is extra natural and not so much what is the content of the.
yeah, yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
okay,
It
thank
is.
you very much, CD.
In another sort of, in a sort of roundabout sort of way, what Ibn Arabi is trying to say, which is a point I agree with, generally speaking, that the apostleship or the station of any given person is not dependent on the affirmation of what is outside of them, right? That this kind of perspective that you need something to affirm something else, in a sense, is backwards. It's a wrong perspective. So the apostle's affirmation is his own station, and not what something beyond him is saying he is or he is not.
I completely agree with that point, but doesn't this external confirmation it is to serve the others,
Yeah, sure.
the let's say the layman as us to recognize him.
Mhm. Sure.
Okay,
But
okay.
then this is the Fusus al-Hikam. It's trying to speak about the inner reality of these things, not the so it's the layman, the awam are the awam. They believe what they believe, and they can be swayed this way or that way. They will believe in the Dajjal according to the religions, right? And many will be misled, even the elect. But this is the Fusus al-Hikam. This is trying to tell us about the inner animating reality of a given thing. So why bring up even this example? But we can say that perhaps this is in a very roundabout sort of way. Even Arabi is trying to kind of indicate this other situation.
Yes, thank you, CD.
Anybody else? Really? Nobody has any more questions, anything to say?
Did you read it already?
Yeah.
Oh
You were
my
good.
God, I was 7 minutes late. I missed the whole
Yeah,
thing already.
it's a short chapter. It's only like in the Austin text, it's only about 2.5 pages. No, about 4.5 pages. It's very short.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just read Salman's notes, so I like his notes. I didn't
Yeah,
actually
Salman's
read the
notes.
chapter, but this whole distinction between John and Jesus to me is almost similar to a distinction between, like, I always forget the Islamic terms. My memory doesn't work that great with memorizing terms in another language, but like for me, Jesus is like the batin,
Mhm.
um, and John is like the what is it, Zahir, or
Zahir. Yeah.
and I don't know. I kind of see it like that. Kind of see them as both, two components of the same entity, kind of thing. Whereas, let's call Jesus heads and John tails, kind of thing. That's the way I look at it. I don't know if that's what Ibn Arabi is trying to get to, but I'm not sure, like, that we need to even distinguish one historical person from the other in every
Not
case,
it's not
especially in this case.
not it, not it's not a historical thing. Um what this book is supposed to do is supposed to delineate the esoteric functions, right? So, the figure is the bezel. The insan kamil is the bezel, is the fas of that name or attribute or quality, right? So if John is the bezel of majesty, right? Then what exactly does John's life delineate about that attribute of majesty in the real world? This is the complaint I have, not just over this particular chapter of the Fusus al-Hikam, but the Fusus al-Hikam as a whole, because oftentimes this has been a criticism of mine for a very long time, that what Ibn Arabi is doing, it's almost arbitrary, where he is, you know, calling his chapter by a particular sacred figure, and oftentimes that sacred figure almost appears to be tangential to the overall argument that he's making in the chapter, and we don't really learn why that particular attribute is applied to that particular figure. That has been my complaint of the Fusus al-Hikam from the very beginning. I mean, I love this text more than anything, but this is my complaint about it. So that it feels in many ways, and this particular chapter is kind of a sore thumb example of this, where he's like really trying to fit this figure into a very short narrative of the argument he's making, and then he finishes the argument without really, or completes the chapter without finishing the argument. I did the complete opposite of that in my own Falseness of Wisdom. I spent a lot more time talking about the actual figures that I'm talking about, these women that I'm talking about in each of the majaz, the each of the effulgences, because if we are going to talk, in my opinion, about wahdat al-wujud, then it, in my opinion, that we need to really clearly delineate how a particular figure is the mazhar, is the locus of the manifestation of that particular name, attribute, wisdom, etc. Ibn Arabi doesn't do that in this chapter, and fails, in my opinion, in several of the other chapters of the Fusus al-Hikam. He does it beautifully in the chapter of Adam, and also in the chapter of Muhammad. He does it perfectly, the first and last chapter. But in between the next 25 chapters from Seth to Khalid, it's just very, like, he's really grasping sometimes to example his things, and also to really explain to us why this particular attribute is related to that particular person. So what I've done, and especially in those women of the Bible that I'm talking about, I have done my utmost to explain why that particular attribute that I am, associating with these women, how this manifested in their narrative, in their story, in their kind of, historical narrative per the text. And in several cases, I've had to even, if you read it, I've done the same flipping of the registers of an exoteric narrative to try to explain this, just like Ibn Arabi does in the chapter of Noah and a few other things. Because I think it's important, if you are going to, attribute a quality, a divine quality to a particular insan kamil, that quality be adequately explained as to why it applies to this particular figure. And in much of the chapters of the Fusus al-Hikam, Ibn Arabi doesn't do that. And you see this also as a complaint with a lot of his different commentators, that they are sort of indicating this, that it's not really all that clear why this is the case. So make of that what you will.
Thank you.
Sure.
Maybe as we go deeper into the book, maybe it's becoming, I don't know, this is just a guess, that it's the situation's becoming more and more subtle as we get deeper.
Well,
I mean, maybe, you know what I mean? Like maybe it was easier to begin with.
Sure, but just remember, I mean, the schema that Ibn Arabi tells us in his Natch al-Fusus, his kind of summary of the Fusus al-Hikam, that what he's doing is that, he is doing a very standard kind of a semi-linear procession of the emanations and the self-disclosure, with Adam representing the divine as such. And then as it unfolds from Seth to then the following chapters, it is not getting more subtle. It's actually supposed to be getting more dense until it kind of curves around at the very final chapter. So we're having a sort of like a circular procession from the principle of divinity to the principle of singularity, which is applied to Muhammad as the final chapter, the Hikmat al-Faridiyah. That's what he's doing, and tells us that's what he's doing.
Subtle might have been the wrong word then. Yeah, I agree. Okay, yeah. I see what you mean. Maybe instead of subtle, I should have said complicated or convoluted, like where things are starting to run into each other and
yeah.
Anyway, I'm going to cut myself off there because I don't.
No, but
I lost my train of thought.
You raised a valid point, and this is a valid point that has that I wrestled with for many years reading this text. And it incidentally is one of the things my own sheikh had a problem with Ibn Arabi, precisely for this very reason. He was always very honest with me about it. When he had a criticism of a particular figure of the past, he would say, well, I mean, I've read all the commentaries, I've read this text, I was taught this text both in Arabic and in Persian, and this is what I see. Why is the sheikh doing this? And it just doesn't make any sense. Not just and it doesn't even make sense for us to even say that, we're not getting it. We are getting it because he's putting it out in the way that he's putting it out. And there's such a vast commentary tradition on this text that, like I said, that probably exceeds well over 100 books and 100 authors. And none of them has been able to get their head around this either very well. That there's just something not clicking very well in this argument. Whereas in the Futuhat al-Makkiyah, although you have these ambiguities and you have these kind of very weird sonorous kind of paradoxes occurring throughout it, yet it is a more systematic approach to things than the Fusus al-Hikam, which is extremely condensed. But in the Futuhat al-Makkiyah, what Ibn Arabi is saying, ultimately, even with the enigmas that he poses, whether in his poetry or in his arguments, make a lot more sense than what he's doing in the Fusus al-Hikam with these various chapters.
Thank you very much. That's all I had.
Yep.
No, Shaykh. Sorry, Hussein. You can
Hussein and then Muhammad.
Okay,
thanks. I was just going to take a stab at, because you were saying, how does this attribute of Jalaliya have to do with the chapter? So I was just thinking about that. When I think of Jalal, I think of transcendence. And when I think of Jamal, I think of immanence. So I thought maybe because here there's a question about like the servanthood of these two figures, John and Jesus, and it might be ambiguous in Jesus's case because he's attributing well-being to himself. So he's like taking the place of the Spirit and speaking directly. And so that might be a kind of immanence and perhaps
Jamal, yeah.
beauty.
Yeah.
And then in the case of John, it's in the third person, so it's being said about him, and his servanthood is being affirmed.
Well, Qaysari cites this hadith between as of a conversation between John and Jesus, which I think goes to your point. This hadith goes something like this, where John asked Jesus, how can you be so certain of God's mercy? And Jesus answers, how can you be so certain of God's wrath? That is, one is questioning about the divine beauty, and the other one is questioning about the divine majesty. That's fine. If you want to look at it from that level, that's fine. I would, however, if I was going to talk about majesty, I would, basically gloss majesty from that first theophanic sequence of the Hadith Kumail, where, he tells, Ali alayhi salam tells Kumail, when Kumail asks, Mal haqiqa, what is ultimate reality? Ali answers, Kashf subuhat al-jalal min qayr isharat, the disclosure of the glorifications of the divine majesty without indication. Because there's so much in what Ali alayhi salam is delineating about the nature of the revelation of the divine majesty just in that phrase, that I would probably use that to kind of disclose the nature of the divine majesty, rather than this conversation that we don't even get to see in the text of the Fusus al-Hikam itself, but the other commentators, especially Qaysari, cite. Muhammad Rahal, you had a question.
Yes, it's something similar about the titles chapter, and how he talks on that paragraph about the wall. And I don't know if it has something to do with that aspect of reality with it, which is harsh, no? And like it doesn't speak to the ultimate reality.
Yes, that's what I was saying when I was saying that perhaps in a roundabout sort of way, what Ibn Arabi is trying to convey here is this juxtaposition between the nath, the negation, and the isbat, the affirmation, where the wall represents the mundane reality, the veiled reality of the world, dunya, and the apostle represents the unveiled reality of the ultimate, or the akhirah, if you would.
Yeah, and maybe it's speaking about the birth of Jesus, but with John, Jesus like born again or something like that, with the baptism thing, like rebirth.
Does anybody know? I know that there is, but can anybody remember the specific narratives of the baptism in Islamic sources? The baptism of Jesus? I know we have versions of it. I just can't remember one off the top of my head, because I have read about it in the Bihar al-Anwar. Does anybody remember?
I'm not familiar with those, no.
The Ismailis have a very interesting way of rubricizing this, and based on what Hassan kind of pointed his finger at, the whole, or what Jeff did, the whole Zahir Batin duality between Jesus and John the Baptist, where during the lifetime of John, Jesus acts as the principle of the Batin, right? And at the moment of John's martyrdom and death, then Jesus becomes the Zahir, which then raises the question, then who replaces that position as the Batin to Jesus? And there's many different answers to this. If you go by the narrative of the Gospel of John, then that would obviously be James, or even Mary Magdalene, according to the Gospel of Thomas, that is. If you go by the Pistis Sophia, then that would be obviously Mary Magdalene, who would act as the botan to Jesus's Zion.
Okay, thanks.
I have to admit, this is one of the most boring chapters for me. It's always been this way. And in another one of my copies of this, I got two of these, and the other one is actually falling apart. This is also falling apart. I've got so many notes written inside the text that you can barely read the actual text anymore. And these are the sorts of things that would pop out at me when I was reading this, and also in one of my photocopies of Nizamuddin Ahmad's edition of the text. I've done the same thing in Persian and Arabic. I've jotted down so many different notes and hawashi and taliqat on this particular chapter. You can barely see the text anymore.
Shay, I have a little follow-up. The discussion between Isa and Yahya alayhim salam, which you mentioned, how you can be so sure about it, and the other one, how you can sure be that it is some kind of dispute between two figures. Both of them are on very high station. That which is example of because in the layman consciousness, we think, okay, so this person speaks in the name of God. He has wahi from God. So what he speaks is absolute truth. If the other person, he is also prophet, he would also speak the absolute truth. If the third person is wali of Allah and he speaks from the name of God, he speaks the absolute truth. So, as a result, what they are saying should be what and the same without any contradiction. But
Well,
it shows that that is
no,
not the
that this
case
is
of
not the case.
all.
No, of course not.
Yes.
This is not the case. And also, Ibn Arabi is very particular about this throughout his other writings, that this is not the case amongst the awliya, that the awliya do disagree on a lot of different things, and this is because the standpoint of shuhud, the mashhad al-shuhud, that the locus of the witnessing of each of the awliya is different. It's not the same from one wali. Yes, sure, they have been annihilated in the same primary principal source of all things, but from a particular way station, in a particular modality, in a particular name. So whereas, John's attribute is being attributed as being Jalali, or transcendent and majestic, Jesus is more of a Jamali, so he's seeing it from more of an immanent. Let's see, let's go back here. Jonah, Solomon, Ezra, Shu'aib, Jesus. This is what Ibn Arabi does. He doesn't even attribute an actual attribute to Jesus. He calls it, the chapter 15, by the attribute of prophecy, nubuwiyah, right? So, and this has been another question, what is Ibn Arabi doing here? Oh, you have all of these major prophetic figures coming with divine attributes, but Jesus instead becomes the archetypal prophet rather than representing the archetypal name or attribute. This is another enigma of Ibn Arabi's. Why are you doing this? Why are you attributing this to Jesus and not a name? But yeah, you're right. This is not the case. The awliya do disagree with each other. I mean, the most classic examples of this in the history of Sufism is the dispute between Junaid and Hallaj. Junaid, as much as he he ultimately agreed that what Hallaj was saying was the truth. He didn't dispute that Hallaj, he didn't say Hallaj was lying. His issue was that, you're not allowed to disclose these kind of truth to the masses. And so by that virtue alone, on the exoteric level, you are a mushrik and you're a kafir and you deserve to die. And so he signed his own, he signed Hallaj's own death warrant, even though Junaid was the great master of Baghdad. But his reason was because of, the disclosure of truths that, are not supposed to be uttered in public. And there are many other examples of that. You find in, for example, Attar's Tadhkirat al-Awliya, where there are just like these very caustic arguments that occur between some of the awliya. In Khurasan, some of them are hilarious in the way that he retells these stories, between these various Sufi masters. So it's not the case that, the awliya or the insal kamal, that the perfect humans are going to agree with each other, because each of them is looking at the mystery as disclosed to them from a completely different perspective and standpoint than the other. Even though the principle is the same, is one. Yeah.
Yes, and it very beautifully represents the mystery of Wahdatul Wujud, because while the essence is one, the tajalliyat are
Are infinite.
numerous.
Yeah, are infinite. Absolutely. Yeah. 100% correct. And you can also take this as kind of a perspective on, number one, the diversity of religions, which is the point that Ibn Arabi raises right at the beginning of his preamble. And also, ultimately, you could look at this from the perspective of why, conflict on one level is inevitable in this world. And he says this in the previous chapter that we read about, the nature of equilibrium is not to actually bring things into complete balance with each other. There has to be this whole dynamic that, incompletion is a sort of a completion. And then when, the scale of balance tilts this way, then it must tilt the other way. And this is the actual equilibrium of things in the universe, and that is another reason for it. Yeah, you can definitely apply that principle here for sure.
Some. What's the difference between somebody dying in a state like al-Hallaj and somebody dying in a state where they're like a layman who doesn't have that level of realization? This might be a very long-winded answer I'm prompting from you.
Since none of us have actually experienced that dying state in the state of Allah, I think your speculation is good as mine. But I would say that, based on my own wayfaring and my own experiences, and especially, that a person at that stage of an al-Haq, when they are killed, experience the dropping of the body as a very kind of mundane kind of thing, because that consciousness is already completely absorbed in divine reality. So it's just that fleshy material hindrance is just suddenly removed, and they're blown
Right.
into the principle of things without the prison of the body,
Right.
pushing them down.
So that state of I suppose you could call it a state of change.
Yeah.
Is there some similarity there, maybe even at a facile level, between what would happen if Ezra had the mysteries of destiny revealed to him? Because then he would have had his station changed too. So
Yeah.
I'm sort of wondering, like, how would this shift in stations manifest on an experiential level for us?
Well, very dramatically, because if whether we take this from the point of view just psychology, or whether we go into like the contemporary quantum physics, both of these perspectives are very adamant that how you see things determines the reality of that thing to you, right? And some are even then taking that to the next stage is that how a particular thing is perceived may even influence that reality external to yourself, which is a very interesting way to look at it, and is almost practically from even Arabi's own perspective. So where oneself is concerned, when you have wayfared and you have attained the shores of Fana and Baqa, right? Your material fleshy life is just basically a detail that you yourself can, discard at will. So one can say that even the death of a figure such as Hallaj or even Jesus or even whatever person, in some respects, is even by their own will that it occurs. Whatever the external actors outside of themselves are doing, they have attained that station. They have seen the ultimate reality. They're one with that ultimate reality. So whether they remain in a body or not remain in a body, in some sense, it's kind of the same thing. But the material body for the consciousness inhabiting that body at that point is now just a complete hindrance, even. So
Right.
it would make even more sense to drop it altogether and just ascend altogether to into the principle.
And is that the same thing that's happening with the Mujahideen? Because it said that, you shouldn't weep for them when they're dead. Because
Provided there
they're
are
with Allah.
genuine mujahids and not these baby-killing lunatics that we have been witnessing over the last 100 years who call themselves mujahids, but have
Right.
no respect for the rules of engagement in law and kill innocent civilians. This is the thing. The pre-modern Islamic perspectives on what a mujahid is versus the contemporary one the Islamists have been pushing down everybody's throat are two completely different things. And when you even go into the Quranic literature and its commentaries, even the commentators are very emphatic that atrocities do not constitute a person who is engaging in jihad. When you do jihad, you're supposed to be pushing for the establishment of justice and equity in the world, not to commit injustice and add to the injustice and inequity in the world. This is why, despite the popularity of Hamas, for example, at the present time amongst many of the left, I have been very unequivocal that even though, yes, on one level, there's a justification for the Palestinians to lash out at the Israelis in the way they did back in October 7th, yet the manner that this manifested in them going and killing these innocent children at a rave is just completely, unjustified. Why not target military targets? You should have gone after the military targets and said, those are your real targets, not a bunch of kids who are tripping out on acid at a rave party. I mean, first of all, that's targeting the weak, women and children, where we have explicit traditions saying not to do. So there is no justification for that kind of behavior, even though, yes, in the greater scheme of the Palestinian struggle against the Zionist entity, these people were so pushed against the wall that they lashed out like monsters. But my thing is that this is the problem. And this is something that Jung actually puts his finger on in his own cognitive psychology. He has this typology called enantiodromia, where he takes a principle from, how nature seeks balance and applies it to the phenomenology of pathology in human beings. And what he does with it is that, cognitive dissonance seems to produce a state in a subject that where especially if someone has been perpetrated and tyrannized and oppressed over a long period of time, they start to become it, right? So this is a very important typology in cognitive psychology, and this is exactly what Hamas did on October 7th. Instead of going after legitimate military targets and taking them out, they went after these defenseless ravers, just a bunch of kids, unarmed. In fact, most of the Palestinian kids not affiliated with Hamas on the other side of the fence would have probably preferred to join this rave with these Israelis. They probably would have even been allowed to with open arms to do so, rather than these lunatics going after them and killing these children. This is the problem we have in this typology of jihad in the Muslim world since these Islamists have taken over the discourse over the last 100 so years. I have no love for Israel. I have been very unequivocal that I find this whole project an illegitimate settler colonial project. but the actions of Hamas must be contextualized properly and fairly for what they were. An atrocity like that is not jihad. An atrocity like that is just pure perpetration, nothing else.
Right. Thank you. I agree.
I agree too. Evil fighting evil is not the essence of jihad, that's for sure.
Exactly. Exactly. And there's a caveat about what, who is a real mujahid, right? Because per that hadith where the prophet says we have come from the smaller holy war, jihad al-askar, now we come back to the greater holy war, and they ask them, well, what is the greater holy? It's our fight against our own self. So you arguably, a real mujahid is one who has mastered their own nafs first, and then goes out into the battlefield to fight for justice and equity in the outer world. Not where you get these sexually repressed, mentally ill people on the other side of the fence in Gaza who break in and are raping all these women and murdering these pregnant women and that sort of thing. This is just like, and what bothers the heck out of me is that you have the global left, instead of condemning this kind of behavior, using it, to, just justifying it. We can condemn Hamas and the Israelis simultaneously. I think the Israeli war machine is a genocidal war machine, just like the Nazis, just like the Third Reich. And I will say this openly.
Yeah.
But what Hamas did is the same.
Yeah. And I think the left is in cahoots with the right. I mean, I'm not sure there's any difference. Like,
Well,
they're
at this point,
both.
there is not. No.
And yeah, exactly. That's why it's so difficult for the public to distinguish, okay, who's the bad guy? If it, to use that expression, I hate to use that expression, but who is the villain? And it's hard to say because it's everywhere.
You realize that in the modern period, we have this concept called collateral damage that has been completely normalized and justified now, right? So even with the so-called global left that are supposed to question these sorts of paradigms and narratives, now we have a situation where, oh, well, Hamas were oppressed, the Palestinians are oppressed, so they broke through and they committed these atrocities. These kids were collateral damage. We don't have a concept of collateral damage in our sources. In fact, our sources are very unequivocal that collateral damage is not to occur and has to be minimized. Very simple as that. And so if this collateral damage is occurring on the side that is revolting against its oppressor, then there's a problem here, because then this ceases to be a jihad and becomes a massacre. And that is a sin, pure and simple. So these people are sinners. As simple as that. There's no other way to contextualize this. And I am absolutely appalled and also surprised by the fact that nobody is saying any of this stuff. You have these authorities, even in Iran and in Iraq, who, style themselves as sources of emulation and supreme leaders, et cetera, and they're not saying this stuff, and they're justifying it. And then you have these people lauding all of this and clapping. But in our sources, what occurred on October 7th, the behavior of these so-called Hamas Mujahideen was a sin, period. As simple as that. Civilians, innocent, unarmed people are not to be targeted. Women and children are not to be targeted, ever. Even if the other side does it, you're not to do it yourself, right? Let them be the sinners. Why you? You target legitimate military targets. You do not target civilians. You do not target women and children. As simple as that. If you do, then you're not a mujahid. And moreover, another thing is that you don't commit a series of actions that then brings ruin upon your own people. What kind of idiot does that kind of thing? Whatever has been done to you, however you have been perpetrated. It's, for example, I look at this whole situation since last year as, you have someone in a family who's been abused over a lifetime by one member of the family, right? And then one day, this other member of the family comes with a gun in a family gathering and murders every member of the family. What did these other family members do? They didn't do anything wrong.
No, no. And I can see now why there's so much talk about concern about so-called hate speech. Like here in
Yeah.
the West, anyway, we want to censor everybody because, God forbid, they say something controversial that might be construed as hateful.
Yeah.
And well, because there actually is a lot of deep-seated hatred, not in the average person in general, but obviously everybody knows that on both sides of the fence, you have really deep-seated hatred and rage that's in the DNA. I mean, it's not like it's your own personal hate and rage. It's just the hate and rage of all your ancestors before you and all the
Mm.
injustice that you're sitting on comes bubbling to the surface. And so, yeah, there it's just
This is
simmering right
why, I
there.
mean, my criticism of the Jews and the Zionists has always been around that. You people had the golden opportunity of in millennia, right? After the Second World War, after what the Germans did to you, after that 6 million people were murdered in cold blood by that German war machine, you had the golden opportunity to become a beacon to the world. If you had been smart and attracted these Arab states and these Arabs to yourself by cooperating with them, promising them, telling them, look, let's build this region together. We will make you flourish financially. You help us. We will live together as a single people, as the sons and progeny of Abraham, right? We will make this entire region flourish so that nothing of the sort that the Europeans have been doing over the last 1,000 years will either happen to us ever again or ever happen to you. If they had been smart and they had gone to the Arabs with a project and proposal like that, the world would be a very different place today. And then if then they had turned around and literally implemented this directive of never again that they keep on saying in regard to the Holocaust, right? There would have not been these sorts of atrocities that we've been seeing systematically since the end of the Second World War. There would have never been a Rwanda. There would have never been a Srebrenica or any of the atrocities that were committed during the Yugoslav war, and on it goes. So this tells you that somewhere along the line after the Second World War, even the Jews themselves failed spectacularly in their moral duty. So they can claim to be the chosen people until they're blue in the face. But being chosen, being truly, amongst the mukhlisin, billah, the sincere and the righteous in God requires a certain behavior and certain actions that these people have not demonstrated from themselves, and then have gone and made the argument, they're resisting us, or they're killing us, or they're doing this. But meanwhile, they're committing all the genocide. They committed the Nakba. Now they're doing this now, and on and on and on it goes since 1948. So ancestral hatred of what? I mean, for the 1,000 years in Europe that the Jews were holed up in Eastern Europe and in Southern Europe, etc., the bulk of the atrocities and pogroms and persecution that they faced were by Europeans, not by Muslims. In fact, the Islamic world was their safe haven, and whenever these sorts of pogroms happened, they came into the Muslim world. The incidents of pogroms and anti-Semitism that we have in the Muslim world only start to occur as we're getting closer to the modern period. Right. So there were a few incidents during the Safavid period, which is very interesting. This was the state-imposed ideology that the Safavids. We had one or two incidents that happened during the Safavid period, but the rest of that time, the Jews had a ball in the Islamic world. Nobody persecuted them. They were respected as the Ahl al-Kitab, the people of the book, closer to the Muslims than anybody else. They were left alone. They prospered. They flourished. The greatest merchants of that period were all Jews. No one had any problem with that. It was only now that all of a sudden the Jews have a problem with the Muslim world after they are after that atrocity that was committed in Europe. So what ancestral hatred? They have generated this ancestral hatred themselves now.
Yeah. I didn't mean necessarily like Jew hatred against Muslims or Arabs, but just this. Well, when you have a superiority complex, you hate everybody that you believe is below you. You know what I mean? Like you think that you're the king and everybody else is there to serve you, and so you have a certain disdain for the population because you're royal and they're not. So
This is
that's what I meant by hatred.
Yeah.
And it goes, no matter
You're
which
right, yeah.
cultures come together.
You're
Black
one
people
who-
and white people, Europeans and Jews, Arabs and Jews, whatever. It's always the same story. One believe
Yeah.
they both believe in their own supremacy and their own
Yeah,
right.
but the Arabs and the Muslims don't believe that they're a chosen people, right? Even
True,
if it
true.
is sometimes implied on a certain level, there is no overt doctrine in Islam that says that you are the chosen people and everybody else is like subhuman. There is no
Yeah.
such thing in Islam. In fact, if you go to the text itself, everybody is equal before God and everybody is responsible for their own actions before God. But the ethnic theology of Judaism that you can even extrapolate from the Old Testament itself doesn't look at things that way. The Jews are chosen by the fact that God chose them, and anything, even if they commit sin, this, that, and the other thing, then they're still the chosen people. And the greatest example of the story, as I've kind of put my finger on both in the book and also in other places, is the story of David. David was an adulterer, yet the Mosaic law says that, if you are an adulterer, then you should be stoned to death. You don't deserve life. Yet David got away with it. And the way that he got away with it was by setting up his own best friend and general, whose wife he was after, to die on a battlefield. And so what kind of behavior or what kind of example and paradigm does that set in a psyche who believes it is chosen when its own so-called anointed king is a lecher, an adulterer, and a sinner, and a murderer, and a duplicitous bastard? What kind of seed does that implant in somebody? And the amazing thing is that even the Kabbalah, and I have read the Zohar in its extended version too, doesn't have any adequate explanation for the behavior of David. What David did was, he violated the Mosaic law. He should have been stoned to death. Simple as that. And not anointed the king of Israel.
Yeah. Moral of the story, always be leery of kings.
Well, the moral of the story is to always be leery of contradictions. You either do what you say you're going to do or you aren't. You either establish a principle and you adhere to that principle in every circumstances in the way that, like, for example, Kant's categorical imperative says, or you don't. You can't pick and choose. And the problem with Judaism within its own narratives in the Old Testament is that there's all this picking and choosing. God reveals laws, 10 commandments and other things, and the Jews violate it and get even rewarded for the violation of those things. Their kings and their major patriarchs.
I think for me, the way I always thought about Israeli psychology is that if I were growing up reading stories of the Holocaust and stuff, I think that all of that emasculation and stuff would really weigh very extremely heavily on my psyche.
Yeah.
Right? I'd have a lot of fear of it. I think that when you read stories of being victimized, you imagine yourself as the oppressor too. So I believe that there's maybe some elements of that in anti-drama there. And I also think that, like, the contemporary propaganda saying, like, oh yeah, the Holocaust wasn't actually the Germans' idea, it was because of some Palestinian guy, and basically trying to offset it onto them. And then when they were like going to the hospitals, they're like, oh look, we found a copy of Mein Kampf. Because this is what Palestinians read. They're basically projecting all of this, justified fear of the Holocaust. I mean, that would be something that I'd be very traumatized too, reading about it. And they're basically projecting it onto the Palestinians as well.
And
So they're Nazifying the Palestinians from their own perspective.
And if you had a client that came to you with this sort of thing, trying to project all the problems of someone else, you would immediately glean that there's an element where they're not refusing to take responsibility for something
Right. Exactly, yeah.
And this is, you take this principle and apply it on a collective level, and this is what we're seeing. Whether we're looking at the Second World War era or subsequently. I mean, Hannah Arendt, God rest her soul, I truly love this woman and consider one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century. She put her finger on this in her Eichmann in Jerusalem. And they went after her because she said that the Holocaust was actually facilitated by other Jews based on the testimony that Adolf Eichmann gave at his trial. And, the whole Jewish world just erupted in this just unbelievable anger at her. So many of the elements of the first edition of her Eichmann in Jerusalem subsequently were taken out because she cites the testimony that was given at the Eichmann trial about how certain actual figures were facilitating the transportation and the victimization of their own people in Hungary and in other parts of Eastern Europe. And Eichmann basically said that without the cooperation of these Jews, this event probably wouldn't have been on the scale that it was. So they can blame the Hajj Amin al-Husseinis and similar until they're blue in the face, but the actual physical legal evidence points to themselves. And Hannah Arendt, God rest her soul, said this, put this in black and white in her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem. At least the first edition of it, yeah.
Have you ever read Martin Buber?
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel. Yeah, he's another very interesting. He was a Zionist, but his vision of Zionism was very much in line with what you were saying.
Yeah.
He didn't believe in a state whose explicit cause is Jewish autonomy. He didn't believe in that sort of domineering Judaism, but he believed in the Jews being a light to the world. Yeah.
And if you are not a light, then you're not chosen by anything. If you are not demonstrating any kind of a genuine moral agency in the world, you can claim whatever you want to claim. It doesn't make you it. It's like the situation what we just read about the wall and the apostle. You are the wall in that respect. And the truth is the apostle. But everybody else is seeing, the severed elephant head in the middle of the room. It's about moral agency. That is the bottom line. Without moral agency and one that is demonstrated, so what? Claim whatever you want. Doesn't make you that thing, ever. Anyway.
Sheikh, if you allow
Sure.
me, so it is off-topic question. If
Sure.
you prefer, you cannot comment upon
Sure.
it. But what you have pointed out, the general expression which the Old Testament gives about the different prophets as a whole, a very bad image.
Yeah.
And then, because I'm very confused in this regard, we have one image presented by Bible, then we have the Quranic stories about the prophets. Here in Fusus al-Hikam, again, we have some kind of third reading about the prophets in there. So where here and how we should what should be our attitude to the whole thing?
I don't tell people what attitude they should adopt towards the whole thing, because this is, in my opinion, part of the suluk. If I were to say that this is the way you should look at it, is me trying to impose a dogma. And this is precisely what I want to avoid doing. I think it is not the task of someone like myself to posit a narratival dogma about what a certain figure of sacred figure of the past should be looked upon. I have my own perspective, and I will lay that out. You can agree or disagree with it. That's up to you. My insistence is that people come to their own conclusions about these figures based on, for example, the exampling that you just did between the narrative of the Bible, the Quran, and the Fusus al-Hikam. That these are three different perspectives on the same issue. And they are different perspectives. So we're not in a state of talking about a grape in three different languages. We're talking about completely different perspectives on the same thing. I think that the Awliya in Islam, and especially Ibn Arabi, understood these matters very deeply and grappled with it themselves. Just remember, the Bible had been translated into Arabic at the time of Ibn Arabi. So he would have had access to it. And as well as, probably knew quite a fair bit about the overall tradition of Judaism based on the presence of Jews in Spain for most of the period of the Moorish Empire. So these are sorts of issues that he probably would have grappled with himself, how to reconcile these sorts of narratives. And I believe that his attempt to reconcile these narratives is the Fusus al-Hikam, and then what he also says in the Futuhat al-Makkiyah. Now, one can agree with it or disagree with it, that's up to you. But I don't want to impose or insist on a particular dogma around these sorts of issues, because I think that's the problem that we have, where narratives become almost like idols, right? The purpose of the journey is Tawheed, not the narrative around it. It's the actual realization of the Tawheed itself, not the narrative, these veils of narratives. And this is one of the things I like about the Imami approach to this question when they talk about al-Bada. And in a couple of the other hadith where Imam Jafar as-Sadiq alayhi salam is talking about al-Bada, the alteration of the divine plan, he kind of indicates that one of the reasons for the existence of the alteration of the divine plans where prophecies are concerned is because God is testing humanity on a constant basis as to whether they are fixated on the stories and the sign, or whether they are fixated on him or her or it, right? So if your perspective is God rather than the stories, then you're on the right track. But if you're fixated on the stories and not on God, then you're lost. You're veiled.
And that is the problem of majority, including me, that I should be more fixed on reality, what actually happens,
Exactly.
than the... Okay, thank you very
Because I
much.
mean, you think about it, we have these multiple traditions, and each of them have their own unique prophecies and eschatological frameworks about the end times, and which one is right. Each is saying we are right. The Jew says our perspective is correct, the Christian says the same, the Muslim says the same. And then when you go back into the histories of where these narratives originate, if you do the historical critical process, you realize that there was a lot of borrowing and a lot of influence back and forth, and then you kind of track these narratives, even further down, and find original ones that are very different than the ones that are appearing as prophecies. And this is why al-Bada is such a central doctrine, is that with even a tradition such as Shiism that is fixated on these narratives about the end times, where the Imam Mahdi alayhi salam is concerned, it itself is saying is not to be fixated on the narrative. Your focus should be God and nothing else, not the narratives about the end time, because God is the ever-present, right? So everything that you believe about an eschatology happening in the future, in a sense, is already happening right now by virtue of the principle that establishes. So seek the principle and align yourself with the principle, and let the chips fall where they may, as they may, whenever they fall.
It is also pointed by Sheikh Muhyiddin about the Jews when he says they were very close followers of Jesus while he was in the framework of the Mosaic laws.
That's
But
right.
when he take the station of prophethood with original laws,
Then they run away.
yes. And it is exactly, at least my situation. Okay, this is confirmed, but our historical and traditional narrative, I accept him. But when in contradicts, and it challenge my mindset and perspective, it is very difficult to me to accept it. But I understand it is my problem, and as you are saying, I should follow most close the reality itself than some historical
And the
narrative.
stories about the real, exactly. This is the thing. If when you look at it from even an esoteric perspective, a lot of these stories or narratives and symbols are deliberate ruses. They are tests to see who can, come onto the other side, right? They are God deliberately putting obstacles in the path of a given person to see how dangerous that person is for it, rather than the narrative. And so this is the story of the esoteric in many ways, is that the exoteric seeks self-validation of stories and not the reality, right? And this is what, like I mentioned last week, that religious people are the ones that have the most problems with God. They really do. And So then that's a different thing. You know, those who are truly billah and those who are not. You know, or those who are ma'illah and those who are ladun Allah. Those who are devoid, those who are with God and those who are without, devoid of God. And this is what separates the awam, the generality, from the khawas, the elite and the elect, which in every age, unfortunately, remain very meager and very few.
Thank you very much.
Sure. Okay, we've got an hour and 20 minutes now. Let's wrap it up for this week. So let's start on the chapter of Zechariah. The zikr associated with Zechariah is Ya Maliku, or owner or possessor. And this is actually a better chapter than the one we just read. And then we'll get Elias, Luqman, Aaron, and Moses will be a 2-week chapter. And then we will incorporate the chapter of Khalid into the 2nd week of Moses. And then finally, we're on the final chapter, which will be 2 weeks as well, the wisdom of singularity in the word of Muhammad. And then we'll be done with the book. So in the next probably month and a half, or probably about 8 weeks, I would say, we are finished with this text finally. Anyway, everybody have a good upcoming week. Until we meet again next week. Ya Jalilu.